How do you know when to add a plot twist to your story? And how do you know if you've put enough tension into your story before the climax? We're going to go over 4 different story structures today that are going to help answer those questions and a few more for you. Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm a short story writer who holds a bachelor's degree in creative writing, and I teach the foundations of fiction writing to writers either just starting out, looking to get published, or somewhere in between. I'm bringing my teaching practice online to writers just like you who are ready to take their writing to the next level. And this way, if you stick around here, you won't have to sit through 4 years of school and go into student debt just to be able to write a decent story. So we're going to talk about those 4 different story structures today, and I'm going to give you the framework so you can take whatever you're working on or any idea that you might have and lay it over the framework of these stories to give it a little bit more, structure. Story structure is an overarching term that describes the way that the plot plays out in your story. The way that you structure a story can impact the plot, the pacing, the tension, and how your reader takes in the story. It's important to stop here and acknowledge the difference between plot and story before we go on, because I'll be using both of those terms throughout this, and they're not exactly interchangeable. Your plot isn't your story, and your story isn't your plot. Plot is a sequence of events throughout your story. So for example, in The Wizard of Oz, the plot is the tornado hitting Dorothy's house. Each stop that she makes along the yellow brick road is a plot point, leading up to meeting the wizard and defeating the witch. Those are all plot points as well. But there's so much more that goes on in The Wizard of Oz that completes the story. The plot is just the inciting incident all the way through the resolution, and we'll get into what those terms mean in just a minute. The story is how the tornado takes her to this new world with good and evil witches, with the munchkins, with the Tin Man and the lion, the talking trees, and so many odd characters that she meets along the way. It's how she learns her lessons, it's how she makes new friends, and how she confronts the bad characters. When we talk about story structure, we're talking about plot. The way that you structure your plot can really affect the way that your story feels, how it comes off to your reader, but the plot is just part of your story. There are so many ways that you could structure a story, but we're going to take a look at 4 really popular ones that might help you, especially if you're a beginner or if you have a story that just doesn't quite work and you're not sure why. Freytag's pyramid is a story structure that I remember learning about all the way back in high school English classes, which you may have learned about then as well. And we're going to start with this one because I think most people have at least heard of Freytag's pyramid, and we're going to dive into the details and how to really use it. We've been using this formula of Freytag's pyramid for millennia, really since the beginning of storytelling, but novelist Gustav Freytag was able to dissect this formula and lay it out in a nice chart for all of us to use and learn from. And I want to mention that Freytag's pyramid was originally used for tragedies, but has since been adapted for a more general use. He originally called the resolution at the end of the story the catastrophe, which was when the character took one more punch to the gut, but now we just kind of think of it as a wrapping up of events. So we start the story with some exposition. This gets your reader into the world of the story, gives us some details about what's going on, introduces us to the characters. This usually isn't too long, especially in short stories. We like to keep it really brief so that we can get into the exciting stuff. The inciting incident is where that drama starts. It launches us into the rest of the story. Your whole story is really based on this point. This is what turns for your character and what leads us down the path of this story. In The Wizard of Oz, the inciting incident is that tornado. Without the tornado, Dorothy doesn't end up in Oz and there is no story for us. The rising action is where we start to lay in that tension. Your protagonist is now dealing with the consequences of that inciting incident and they're on a new trajectory in their life. All of this is where your reader invests in the story. They get to know your characters, they get to follow the world that we're in, and you set up all of this so that the next part of your story packs a big punch. In The Wizard of Oz, we see the stakes rising every time that Dorothy adds a new member to her group. They all show us that they want something, and we see this unlikely group of friends defeat obstacles along the way. And we are now invested in those characters, and we want to see them get what they want. The climax is the most exciting part of your story. Everything that you gave us in the rising actions and the exposition is leading us up to this climax. That inciting incident sets us off on a one-way ticket to the climax. Whatever that main conflict of your story is gets confronted here. In The Wizard of Oz, we see this with the defeat of the Wicked Witch. She has spent all this time trying to get Dorothy and her friends off track, but they finally confront her and they defeat her in the climax of the story. The following actions happen after that climax of your story. Things start to get wrapped up, but there might still be a few loose loose ends that need tied up. Some more roadblocks could pop up, but they're nothing in comparison to what we've seen so far. Dorothy and her friends are going to return to the wizard, and we see if they get everything that they wanted. Was all of this worth it for them? The resolution is exactly as it sounds. This is the last little bit of the story that feels like an ending. It's a really good place to leave your story because your reader won't feel like they're missing anything, like you're leaving them on a cliffhanger. And this is where Glinda gives Dorothy the answer to get back home. In the resolution, we have one moment that we call the denouement. A lot of people will refer to the resolution and the denouement as the same thing, but they are different literary terms with different meanings. The resolution is the whole ending, but that denouement is one little piece of the ending where we get this idea of what comes next for the character. We won't continue following this protagonist because the story's over. There's literally no more ink left on the page, but this denouement gives us an idea of what's next for them. We kind of know where they're going and what's happening next, and it's that satisfactory moment where everything gets tied up for us. It's the neat little bow on top of the resolution. Freytag's pyramid is a great way to structure a story because there really are not a lot of constraints in this structure. You just have a few plot points to hit and some guiding actions along the way, but you can really do whatever you want with it. You can really take a classic story or a more modern story and wrap it around this framework because it is so versatile. There are just those few plot points that most stories naturally hit anyway. Now let's look at another structure that also lays everything out for us. We're going to look at a really simple structure called the 7-point structure. This one's also great for those of you who may be new to story structure because again, you have that guide, you have those 7 points to hit, but there's still a lot of room for you to put in your own interpretation and make the story yours. The 7-point structure is a newer structure that was developed by Dan Wells and debuted in 2013 at the Life, Universe, and Everything conference, which is a science fiction conference. The hook is a bit of exposition where we get to know our character, we get immersed in their world, and we start to feel for this character. We start to want to follow them. So plot turn 1 is kind of like that inciting incident in Freytag's pyramid. This moment defines your story and launches us into action, just like the inciting incident. This is the first time that something like this has happened for this character, and it sets them off on a course that is very different from their normal daily life. Following plot point 1, you move our reader towards their first confrontation in the story. This is called pinch point 1. You might see an antagonist appear, or you might see some big roadblock pop up for your protagonist to deal with. The midpoint of the plot is where we see this character shift a little bit. They go from passively moving through the world and kind of figuring out these details and not really sure what to do, to actively taking direction and making decisions and taking charge of what's happening around them. They're now actively trying to solve this conflict rather than just letting it happen to them. In pinch point 2, we see another conflict happen, but this time it's way worse. It's something unimaginable. We aren't sure that the character is going to come back from this, and now we aren't really sure what comes next. And then at plot point 2, our character discovers something that will aid them in the resolution of that conflict. They're on their way to better days, they're on their way to a resolution, they've got something figured out, and they're ready to tackle this conflict. So the resolution in the 7-point structure is actually kind of akin to Freytag's climax, which sounds a little bit contradictory, but if you remember, our character just found something, they just made some discovery that's going to help aid them in beating this conflict that's been looming over them the whole story. So now as we're approaching this resolution, the tension is still building and we're still not quite sure if they're going to figure it out, but we hope that they do, and we see them confront this conflict at least one more time. And then as the author, you get to decide, do they succeed or do they fail? What happens to them in this moment? If you choose to structure a story this way, it may help you to plan the hook, plan the midpoint, and then the resolution, and then fill in those gaps. How do we get from all of those points to the next? This is a great structure to go on quests with, and it's great for genres like sci-fi, since the sci-fi community developed it for their stories. Now we're going to take a look at a structure that is all about the drama. You've probably heard about the 3-act structure if you've ever done a Google search for story structures. Playwrights and screenwriters often use this story structure, and it's a story in 3 parts, and that concept dates back all the way to at least Aristotle. He was the first to write it out explicitly, but again, it's a structure that we've been seeing storytellers use since the beginning of storytelling. With the 3-act structure, we're looking at the setup, the conflict, and the resolution. And it's important to remember that one act leads into another here. And we're going to take a look at this in conjunction with Freytag's pyramid, because there are quite a few similarities, and it might help you see those acts on that graph too. So Act 1 is the setup of this story. We're looking at things like the exposition and the hook of the previous structures that we've talked about. You're introducing us to the character's world, to the characters themselves, and what this story is maybe going to be about. And at the end of Act 1, we get that inciting incident. And remember, this is what sets the rest of the story in motion. It lays the tone for the rest of what's to come. So Act 2 is the conflict, and leading from that inciting incident at the end of Act 1 into Act 2, we're starting to see those rising actions. This is where the tension builds. We start to see people having to overcome obstacles, and usually there's some kind of villain at play too. And throughout this act, you're gonna have to raise the stakes a few times to keep your reader interested. You're gonna have to layer that tension in, and you're gonna have to work at that so that by the time that we get through Act 2 into Act 3, your reader is ready to know what happens. And the end of this act is the climax. So again, it's important to just continue to build all of those stakes, to build that tension until we get to the end of Act 2. So Act 3 is known as the resolution. This is where we get our falling actions, our resolution, and the denouement. This is where you resolve the conflict and you start to wrap things up and give us an idea of what's next for the characters. And because the 3-act structure was designed for plays originally, we tend to use this resolution to really wrap things up and answer all of those questions. There's usually not a sequel, there's usually not something else for the reader to go to learn more about the story, so we want to make sure that they leave with all of their questions answered. So the next time that you go see a play or a movie, take a look at that plot structure, and I bet that you can see the 3-act structure working its magic. This is a great structure because, again, it gives you all of those points to hit, and it tells you exactly how to do it and when. So if you're new to story structures, this is also a really great one to start with, just like Freytag's pyramid. And lastly, we're going to look at a story structure that is pretty unstructured. So this structure is called in media res, which is Latin for in the middle of things. And that is exactly where we start our story, in the middle of things. So remember what I said earlier about how plot is that sequence of events and story is how those sequence of events gets portrayed to your reader. That's really important to note here in this structure. So let's get into what I mean by that. So when you start in media res, your opening scene is really closer to the middle of your story. So if you were to take all of the plot points in your story and lay them out in chronological order, your first scene you're gonna pick from the middle of your story. In media res has roots as far back as the Odyssey and the Iliad. Homer opened both of these epics in the middle of the action. The Odyssey opens with Calypso holding Odysseus captive and all of those suitors preying on his wife back home. And the Iliad starts with Achilles and Agamemnon fighting in the Trojan War. So when I say that in media res starts in the middle of the action, in the middle of your story, I really do mean from the first sentence. We are thrown right into that story. This is supposed to be a good way to hook your reader, to show them something exciting right off the bat, and then fill them in later. But to do this well, I believe that you have to mix in some exposition in here. You have to show your characters, you have to show the setting, and kind of give your reader something to latch onto to ground them in this story. Otherwise, your reader might see this epic battle or this really tense scene, but they're not really sure what's going on quite yet. You know, they're still figuring out this world, so it might not mean as much to them as it could down the road. During all of this action, we do still need to know who everybody is, where we are, and what's happening. So these are just a few story structures that I would really recommend to beginning writers or anybody who wants to take a story that they think just isn't quite working right now and fill in some gaps, help them put that structure over their story. And you can check out my last video on building tension to help you with those rising actions and help you build up to that climax. So be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons so that you don't miss out on these videos and so that you can help me reach more writers in the same position as you and we can all learn and grow our skills together. And I know I mentioned a lot in here that we really do need to know your characters for some of these structures to work. So if you're interested in more ways on doing that, I do have a training linked in the description below about a character profile training. Teaches you how to effectively use it, what actually matters, what's really important, and then how to take the information in your character profile and translate it onto your story. Okay, well, I'll see you next time, and until then, happy writing.